Hey, it's Luke Thomas. I'm the founder of Friday, and welcome to another episode of Remote Rants, where I find some interesting content online. We talk about it, we try to break it down in the hopes that you and I both learn a thing or two. So I just came across this really great video by Jason Lemkin. Big fan of his content and the work that he does in the software as a service space. He just published this great video talking about kind of how your communication needs to change when you go remote. I had a few thoughts about it, but in today's episode, I'm going to kind of play parts of the video, and then we're going to discuss it, and then I'll actually show you how you could go about solving these. So yeah, here we go.
I think one of our biggest challenges as leaders, as CEOs, as founders, figuring out how to work better together today as distributed teams, as newly distributed teams, not folks like GitLab or Zapier that have worked on it hard for years, not folks that have even done it intentionally, but folks that have been forced into being distributed teams. That's most of us today. And I'll share at least the 5 things that we've worked on, that I've worked.
I just want to quickly point out, I stopped the video at the wrong time, but there is a difference between kind of the advice that you might get from someone who's been doing the remote thing for many, many years and someone who is kind of in the thick of things. So it's one thing I would like to point out is when you have been fully distributed for a while, it's easy to underestimate the behavioral change required to implement some of this stuff. And so, yeah, this is something that I think it's easy for a fully remote company to discount because they've kind of many times created these behaviors from the ground up from the beginning of the company. It's different when you are suddenly forced to do this and you have to kind of create these new behaviors on top of existing ones.
Worked on and how they've worked and how they haven't, and how we're going to do the next phase of these action items to try and get better at communication. Because I think for most of us, we've gotten a little bit worse at communication since shelter, and it's time to step it up because it's going to be like this for quite a while. So the number one thing that I tried to do is a daily Jason. And a daily Jason was an email, and I would wake up every morning, and at about 7:30, I would send a lengthy email. The first 3 points would be our goals for the week, so everybody knew what were our top 3 goals, and I would force myself to force rank our team level goals. And the rest would just be things I'm learning, what's going on with SaaStr, what's going on with content, community, sponsors, and the rest. And at first, the Daily Jason seemed great. People got it. It aligned us in going from the old normal to a transition phase to the new normal. And I did about 34 Daily Jasons every day, including Saturday and Sunday, because I was still working the same on Saturday and Sunday during shelter, since it really wasn't that different. But after about 30, they really fatigued the team. The team started to get worried about all of these action items, about 30 times 3. So that's 90 times I told everybody what we needed to get done this week. It was too much. People sometimes felt they were failing against it. They felt it was too much information. They felt even maybe that it picked at them a little bit, even when it didn't intentionally do so. So at first
This is an interesting point, and I'm not going to comment. I mean, this is something where it's possible maybe the right answer was, start off by doing this for a week and then shift to weekly. Clearly, the daily cadence may be overwhelming over, a long period of time. I like the intention, really like the idea. I personally do a weekly top-down update, and maybe how I would encourage others who are watching this video or listening to the audio to think about is, what is the purpose? I think of, your job as a founder, as a CEO, the goal is to kind of steer the ship, right? And there are times where you need to really, crank the wheel. And there are other times where you need to kind of just do small, slight course corrections. And sometimes you don't even need to have your hands on the steering wheel. And so perhaps the daily cadence was kind of this example where you're kind of constantly turning the wheel and maybe you didn't need to. So overall, though, the idea of a top-down update from a CEO or from an executive is something I would strongly recommend. And it's actually something you can do on Friday. So you can see how that works here. You can see we have a workflow. I'm not going to spend much time here, but I do this every week. I kind of quickly answer what's on my mind, some general performance and metrics, and other updates. It's up to you. You could outline priorities, you can relay customer and market feedback. It's really up to you, but the idea is that there needs to be some type of top-down alignment that happens outside of, a monthly status update meeting. Back to the video.
It worked, and I think it aligned us clearly on what our goals were after shelter, because everyone knew every day. But now I've dialed it back to once a week. Every day ended up being a little too much of the daily Jason. The second thing we did, as many of you did, is we dusted off daily stand-ups. I had not done a daily stand-up in longer than I care to remember. At this point in my life, my career, I really didn't want to do any stand-ups. I really would prefer to have no standing meetings, as hard as that is to do. But the last thing I wanted to do was a daily stand-up. But I learned we needed to do it, and we've done a daily stand-up. We've experimented. We've done it at 1:30, which is what we do now, and we briefly did it sort of old school engineering scrum style, first thing in the morning. And what I learned with our team in this world, and a cross-functional team, is the daily stand-up is critical, at least for us. Maybe you don't need to do it every day, but it's good. We now communicate, at least in some ways, much better than we did. Everyone talks, everyone shares, and we learn more. But what didn't work in the daily stand-up was using it as a true stand-up, as a scrum, for folks to share what they're working on in classic sort of bite-sized engineering pieces. Today, I'm working on this piece of code. It was really too much for folks on our team, which are really no engineers. And because folks weren't able to really break their work up into daily chunks, it ended up being just a handful of us would talk on these daily stand-ups after about 30 days in. So we switched, which goes to the next point of my third of five, which is to use Slack differently. And we did a hybrid approach. We keep our daily stand-ups at 1:30, and the leaders do talk more than the rest, but it's okay. That's just for other folks to ask questions, share learnings, share wins during the day. It's to check in midday for the work we've already done during the day. And then everyone in Slack puts in the top 3 things they're going to work on that day.
So yeah, just a quick highlight of what Jason said. They do a daily meeting at like 1 or 1:30, I think he said. And then they also, before the meeting, they share what they're working on, right? And so the way I like to break this down is that meetings should not be primarily just for information or status updates. Those are the meetings that people hate. Those are the meetings that could have been, quote unquote, an email. And what I kind of like about this cadence is that there's still the information sharing component, right? But that is happening outside of the meeting. And so when you walk into the meeting at 1:30 or later in the day, you spend less of your time just kind of talking in a very like informational context about like what you're doing, and instead you have this context and this foundation for discussion. Additionally, there's this little tweak that kind of happens when you stop sharing information in a meeting, is you end up kind of spending more of your time kind of focused on the relationship piece because you've got the information sharing out of the way. And so, yeah, once again, you can do this inside of Friday as well. So you could do a daily stand-up, and you can do this asynchronously. And some of our customers, they don't even have a meeting. For example, I don't have a daily stand-up meeting because we share this information asynchronously instead. So you can see here, what did you accomplish yesterday? What are you working on today? Any blockers? Another option you could pick and choose from is, what are you working on today? And do you have anything else to share? So it's a chance for people to kind of share, hey, I'm going to be out at 2 p.m. today. I have to, pick up my child at daycare or something else. So it's kind of blending the work with the fun or with the personal side of things. So anyway, yeah, back to the video.
There are other Scrum tools, there's other Slack tools, but with the small team, we just found everyone just checks in on their 1, 2, or 3 things they're working on today. So everyone knows that first thing in the morning. And then we all check in at 1:45 to talk informally on the day. And for us, 3 points in Slack in the morning and 1:30 in the afternoon to check in live is the right combination. Importantly, on point 3 for us, I've learned a lot about how to use Slack. And as a leader, I've sometimes found Slack tiring over time. I found people use it to send me tasks and things to do that they wouldn't do in person or by email. They would hesitate to send an email and ask me to do something. They would certainly hesitate to ask me in person, but they have no issue just slacking me to have them do something for them. And I want to help everyone, of course, on my team, as do you, but the more senior you are in the org chart, the more overwhelming it can be when everyone feels like they can task up. It just doesn't work. So
what's interesting about this, just as a quick aside, I'm not going to spend much time here, but when you're in the office, imagine being the average employee and seeing, the CEO running around from meeting to meeting to meeting. It gives you this interesting insight that helps regulate the amount of work or the amount of requests that you ask someone to do, right? So if I know that, my boss or whatever has been in meetings all day, maybe it causes me to hesitate when just like throwing or assigning a task or like asking a random question that maybe you didn't need to ask. This is a very interesting insight because there is some level of like self-regulation when you can observe and kind of get an understanding of what someone's day is like. Whereas when you are all behind a screen, you almost can only use, like, you only have a few signals to use, whether it's, how active are they in Slack? Are they sending me emails? Are they doing other things? Like, it doesn't really give you a great sense of like what their day actually looks like.
I became Slack fearful of people asking me in yet another place, yet another medium to do things when I was overloaded as a leader and as an individual contributor. So, but using Slack as a wiki, that's how we use it now. So folks check in the morning, they log the 3 things they're going to do. Everyone logs wins during the day, wins with partners, wins with content, wins with sponsors, etc. But we don't use it as a group task manager. And that's been great for us. A dynamic wiki is how we've used Slack to win. And then
here's what's going to happen. The dynamic wiki will come back to bite you in the future, because what happens is that, Slack in many ways, we use it internally. We use Slack, we use a project management tool, and we use clearly our own tool, Friday. And the way I think about it is that Slack is really great for that quick back and forth collaboration, but unfortunately, each conversation is kind of treated the same way. And whereas at work, your conversations, there are varying levels of importance, right? Think almost like a performance review is a very, very important conversation, whereas a quick back and forth update in Slack is not. And where Slack can kind of get into trouble is when you, in many ways, treat it as a wiki, because you run into these issues where everything is flowing into channels, and it requires that people regulate themselves, and oftentimes that doesn't happen. So one channel can quickly devolve. Each conversation is treated the same way, so it becomes lost. This is something that, if you look at most of the remote teams, they've created some type of abstraction layer, whether it's a wiki or another tool, to help people kind of share what's going on at a high level. So this kind of comment kind of speaks to this need to kind of abstract the conversations into like a meaningful structure.
2 other points. The fourth one, which which you're all doing, but I've learned everyone's doing, which is zooming more with your customers.
I'm just going to skip over this, not because I don't think it's great advice, because it's not as relevant for the internal kind of remote team like management or communication point of view that we're trying to drive home. But it's a great point. I mean, Zoom breaks down the barriers to getting on calls with your customers, so you should do more of it. So let me just skip ahead.
For folks in real life, but what's going to change is we're also going to have to do the Zooms and newly distributed teams as one-on-ones. And I'm both a huge, I would say, of adapting to leadership.
Let me just skim.
And you need to find a way to make that happen. That with our top 10 customers or our top 5%. But now what's going to happen is the top 30% are going to expect to talk with leadership. And you need to find a way to make that happen and to make it part of your life. The last point I would say of adapting to work during shelter and newly distributed teams is one-on-ones. And I'm both a huge fan of one-on-ones and I struggle with them. I've written on SaaStr many times that as a leader, one-on-ones are one of the most important things you can do. Is ideally once a week or at least once every 2 weeks, depending on how many reports you have an unstructured meeting. A meeting where the folks that report to you can just share what's on their mind, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It creates new learnings together. It's bonding. It lets you have unstructured thoughts. And I really don't think there's much more important for leadership and management than one-on-ones with your reports.
Totally agree. I think one-on-ones is one of the most important things, you can do as a leader. Here's where I kind of differ on the advice maybe. So the one-on-one, as a quick refresher, it's the employees meeting, they own the agenda, they own what they want to talk about. But what ends up typically happening is the first 10 to 20 minutes of the conversation, you as a leader are trying to kind of tease out what's actually going on. So the conversation may start some way like, hey, how's it going? How are you feeling? what are you working on, right? So it's kind of this, there's this data exchange that happens in the early part of the meeting where in many ways it's actually quite structured. Because you're asking questions to try to scope the conversation to figuring out where you can like spend the rest of the meeting. And so what's really interesting about this is it's a massively valuable exercise and you need to do it. But the question is can you actually, from my point of view, you can actually kind of, you can do two things. The first is you can actually ask structured questions before the meeting happens. Things like, so if we were to use a tool like Friday, we could create a workflow from scratch that just says, hey, how are you feeling, right? How are you feeling? You could ask another question like, what are you proud of this week? You could ask another question like, any roadblocks? And you could set it up so it just goes to you, right? Or the managers in your company. And so what you can do here is you can actually accelerate that one-on-one meeting significantly because you're able to collect this data beforehand that you can then use as a prompt or to help kickstart your conversations in the meeting itself. And there's a few bits of nuance here that are actually really, really important. The first is this idea, which can be a bad thing, but it can also be used in a good way. It's called the online disinhibition effect. And here's the long story short with what you need to know about that. People are more honest behind a screen. And sometimes that can be used in a negative way. Imagine like a Twitter comment or a Facebook comment. People say things behind a screen that they would never say in person. And it can be a very, very bad thing. But you can also use this reality that people are more honest behind a screen to help you gather better data so that you can have better one-on-one meetings in particular. And so what you have to do as a leader is you have to scope the questions or the prompts so that you can tease out that insight. I guarantee you that probably half of the people that report to you would rather write beforehand, collect their thoughts, and come up with some type of comment or thread about their week before they walk into the meeting. And it gives you just this really, really rich context that can be benchmarked over time. There's some really great things that you can do here when you do it asynchronously or in a written context before the real-time meeting. As I may have mentioned earlier, this can also help you dramatically accelerate the meeting itself because you're cutting out like the first 15 minutes of the conversation. It's really quite nice. Another thing you can do is you can gauge sentiment without the need to have a meeting. So there are many weeks where I will collect feedback from some employees and they don't even want to have a one-on-one. Everything's fine. They don't need to have it. And quite frankly, it's the employee's meeting. So I'm just going to let them do that. Whereas other employees, they want to talk every week and that's fine, right? So I guess what I would encourage anyone who's watching this video to do is think about having written communication play a complementary role to your real-time one-on-ones. Don't ditch the one-on-one, just kind of provide a complementary kind of balance to it.
But what I found during shelter is that they're of course different. So I found that they need to be longer to work. People just have different expectations.
This is, sorry to jump in again, but this is oftentimes because you don't have this bedrock of data that you were previously getting in the office. And so what you have to do is you spend more time asking questions to try to tease out what is actually going on. It absolutely takes longer, but like I said, there's a way that you can accelerate this process.
And because of that, it's hard to do as many, and you may find yourself not wanting to do as many. And for me, I do a fair amount of one-on-ones, but in the office, they are almost all unstructured. I've gotten to the point in my life where I didn't want to have 80 standing meetings in my calendar. You probably need them. But I would do the one-on-ones, but we would just grab each other. Grabbing each other, it really doesn't work as well during distributed times and shelter times. So I found the areas where I've invested more on one-on-ones, I've had more success, and where I have scaled back, I haven't. So you've got to schedule more one-on-ones. You have to make the time, just like you have to make far more time with your customers now on Zoom. You have to make more time somehow with your team. And my little technical tip there is I love Zoom. We use Zoom all the time, but for my one-on-ones, we love our Facebook portals. They're little devices. They sit right next to the computer. They have a high resolution camera that tracks you, and it's less tiring than staring at your screen. And we just portal in. I'm looking at mine right now next to my computer. It's more relaxing. I can say hi, and then I can even do work while we're doing our one-on-ones or share a document or collaborate. So we love the portals as a less intensive way to have real-time video and audio collaboration. But again, those are the 5 ideas to think about. Daily communication, daily Jasons were too much. We've moved to weekly, but they're good. Daily stand-ups help us, and we're going to do them every day, but not necessarily have everyone have to break it up into weekly bite-sized chunks. Use Slack as a wiki. Be prepared to talk to 10 times more customers going forward. That's point 4. And lean in even more on one-on-ones. You got to find a way.
Overall, yeah, just to recap, this is a great video. These tips are really great, especially for newly remote teams. And so, yeah, I think content like this is great because there's so many people who've been doing remote work for a while. I mean, myself included, where it can be difficult at times to remember what it was like to be newly remote. And so there's a lot of companies that are trying to figure this stuff out, and I'm glad that there's content being produced to help bridge the gap. So anyway, that's the end of today's episode, and I hope this was interesting and useful for you. Thanks.